The freezing rain slashed sideways, a curtain of ice turning the ridge into a hostile blur. My fingers, usually steady, fumbled uselessly with the jagged aluminum of my snapped tent pole. I had calculated everything: mileage, elevation, caloric burn, but I hadn't calculated the sheer violence of this storm. Then, movement at the tree line. She stepped out of the gray, not fighting the wind, but moving through it. Rachel. We didn't speak of propriety. My tent, she shouted over the gale. It's rated for 2. We just need the body heat. The zipper screamed shut, sealing out the world. I didn't come to the mountains to find company. I came to lose the noise. My life in the city is a carefully constructed architecture of demands, client crises, the endless friction of negotiation, the weight of being the one who always knows the answer. Silence is the most expensive commodity I know, so I spent a week's worth of focus just to get here, to this jagged spine of rock where the only negotiation is with gravity. The granite was slick with moss, the air thin and biting. I moved through it with the rhythm I'd been craving, the burn in my legs, a welcome replacement for the mental fatigue of the last 6 months. I had seen her earlier that afternoon. She was a silhouette against the pale sky, pausing at a switchback. I stopped, watching. It's a habit I can't break. Assessing the people around me. She didn't look like a tourist. Her pack was worn, her stride efficient. She moved with an economy of motion that suggested she knew exactly what her body could do. No wasted steps, no hesitation. Just a steady, relentless ascent. I felt a flicker of respect, perhaps even a mirrored recognition, before I turned back to my own path. I prefer the trail empty. I prefer the illusion that I am the only one conquering the ascent. But the mountain has a way of humbling you. The shift happened around 4. The light didn't fade so much as it was bruised out of the sky, turning a sickly, heavy purple. The air pressure dropped so fast my ears popped, a physical warning that the atmosphere was about to break. The scent of ozone and wet earth rose up, sharp and metallic. It was the smell of danger. I knew I had to pitch camp, and fast. I found a clearing, a small shelf of rock exposed to the wind, but flat enough for sleep. I was moving fast, my movements practiced. I've done this 100 times. I threaded the poles, the nylon snapping like a whip in the rising gale. I leaned in to secure the guy line, putting my weight against the sudden gust. Then, the sound. Crack. It wasn't a soft sound. It was the sharp, irrevocable report of metal failing under stress. The main support pole sheared clean in half, the jagged edge tearing through the rain fly. In a second, my shelter was nothing more than a pile of expensive fabric flapping uselessly in the mud. I stood there, staring at the wreckage. The rain began then, cold and stinging like needles. I had options. Technically, I could try to bivvy in the open, wrapped in my bag, and risk hypothermia. I could try to hike down in the dark, navigating slick scree with a headlamp that would be swallowed by the fog. Or I could wait. I knew she was behind me. I had tracked her pace. She would be reaching this shelf in 20 minutes. The internal debate was a physical thing, a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with the cold. I am not a woman who asks for help. I am the one who gives it, who solves the problem, who stabilizes the chaotic element. To stand here, shivering, waiting for a stranger to save me from my own equipment failure, it tasted like ash. It felt like a surrender of the competence I prize above everything else. But as the temperature plummeted, I felt the cold seep through my layers, seeking the heat of my skin. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the simple, brutal physics of exposure. The wind howled, a lonely, tearing sound. I realized then that pride is a luxury for the warm. Out here, in the wet and the dark, autonomy was a dangerous illusion. I watched the tree line, waiting to trade my solitude for survival. The wind tore the words from our mouths before they could fully form. We didn't exchange names, pleasantries, or apologies. We traded commands. "Grab the poles," she shouted, her voice cutting through the roar of the gale. "Not those. The rainfly. Hold it down." It was a negotiation of survival, stripped of all social niceties. I am used to boardrooms where power is currency, exchanged in glances and pauses. Here, power was just the ability to keep a sheet of nylon from becoming a kite. She moved with a terrifying efficiency, her hands red and raw but steady, anchoring the shelter while I fumbled with the clips. She didn't look at me with concern. She looked at me like a variable she needed to solve. When we finally dove inside, the silence was the first thing that hit me. The wind was still screaming, but the thin walls severed us from it. It created a sudden, jarring intimacy. A two-person backpacking tent is a theoretical concept, not a spatial reality. It assumes two people who are comfortable breathing the same air, whose limbs are meant to tangle. We were strangers, soaking wet, crammed into a space the size of a coffin. I sat hunched, water pooling around my knees, feeling massive and intrusive. My precision, my careful planning, it all felt ridiculous in the face of her calm. Rachel sat cross-legged, wiping water from her face, her eyes assessing the limited real estate between us. "We have to get dry," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. "Hypothermia sets in faster when you're stopped." Here was the negotiation. To survive, we had to strip. To strip, we had to breach the wall of propriety that usually separates strangers. The air in the tent was already heavy with the smell of wet wool, ozone, and the sharp, metallic scent of adrenaline. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the zipper of my jacket. The proximity was overwhelming. If I moved my elbow, I would hit her ribs. If she stretched her legs, she would tangle with mine. "Turn around?" I asked, the request sounding absurdly small. "There's nowhere to turn," she replied, her voice low. She didn't look away. She wasn't being predatory. She was being practical. That unflinching gaze, it unnerved me more than the storm. It saw too much. "Just get the layers off. We need to stabilize our core temps." We moved in a jagged, awkward dance of elbows and fabric. The sound of wet synthetic peeling off skin seemed deafening in the small space. I kept my eyes on the tent wall, counting the stitches in the seam, trying to grant her an illusion of privacy she hadn't asked for. But you can't share a space this small without sensing everything. I felt the shift in the air when she pulled her shirt over her head. I saw the pale blur of her shoulder in my peripheral vision, the strength in her back, the vulnerability of bare skin in the freezing air. We organized the gear with militant precision to reclaim some control. Wet clothes in the vestibule, dry bags at the foot. It was a way to impose order on a situation that felt dangerously fluid. "We need to consolidate," she said, pulling a dry thermal top on. She gestured to the sleeping pads. "If we stay on opposite sides, we lose heat to the ground. We need to put the pads together." I nodded, throat tight. We arranged the mats until they formed a single floor. We were building a bed. There was no other word for it. "It's just for the heat," she said, catching my eye. Her voice was steady, but there was a flicker of something else there, an acknowledgement of the line we were blurring. "The rating on this tent assumes shared warmth. Physics doesn't care about comfort." "Right," I managed, my voice sounding foreign. "Thermodynamics." "Exactly." She reached up and clicked off the lantern. The darkness didn't fall. It rushed in, absolute and heavy. The visual world vanished, leaving only the sensory reality of her. I could hear the rustle of her sleeping bag as she slid in, the soft exhale as she settled. The distance between us was measured in inches, a fragile buffer of air that felt electrically charged. The storm raged outside, but the real tension was right here. Sealed in with us. We were safe from the wind, but we were dangerously exposed to each other. Darkness changes the architecture of a room. In a tent, it erases the walls entirely. There was only the roar of the wind, a chaotic, thrashing beast trying to tear us off the mountain, and the counterpoint of her breathing. It was steady, rhythmic, infuriatingly calm. Lying there, staring up into the absolute black, I felt my own heart hammering against my ribs, a traitorous staccato. The space between us was cold. A draft snaked up from the floor, biting through the sleeping bag, a reminder that nylon is a poor defense against a freezing rainstorm. I tried to stay rigid. I tried to maintain the 6 inches of sovereignty I had claimed. But the cold is a patient predator. It seeped into my toes, my hips, the small of my back. Shivering started as a vibration and escalated to a spasm. I clenched my jaw, refusing to make a sound, but the sleeping bag rustled with my tremors. "You're freezing," Rachel's voice came out of the dark. It wasn't a question. It was an observation of data. "Turn over, back to back. It's the most efficient way to share core warmth." I hesitated in the dark. The command made sense. It was standard survival protocol, but the reality of it felt like a cliff edge. To turn my back to her was to surrender defense. To press against her was to admit need, but the biting cold didn't care about my pride. I turned. The contact was shocking. Through the layers of down and nylon, her heat was a sudden, solid wall. We pressed together, spine to spine, shoulder blades aligning. It wasn't soft. It was structural. I felt the tension in her frame, the solid line of her muscles, and then the warmth took over. It hit me like a physical weight, immediate and grounding, seeping from her high-output engine into my shivering frame. It should have been purely medicinal, but it didn't feel medicinal. It felt electric. The point where our shoulders touched became the center of the universe. I lay there, hyper-aware of every micro-adjustment she made. Was she asleep? Her breathing hadn't changed, deep and slow, but her body held a stillness that felt alert. I wondered if she could feel the tension radiating off me, if my rigidity felt like rejection or panic. Time dissolved. The storm outside became abstract, a painting of violence that couldn't touch us. The only reality was the heat. I found myself relaxing into it, my muscles unspooling one by one. I drifted, half-conscious, suspended in the strange comfort of a stranger's warmth. Then I shifted. It was involuntary, a muscle spasm in my calf or a need to adjust my hip. My arm slipped from its tuck and fell backward. My hand brushed against her arm. I froze. It wasn't a grab. It was a graze. My bare knuckles against the inside of her forearm. Her skin was hot, dry, shocking against the cool air of the tent. I should have pulled back. The polite social contract demanded an immediate sorry and a retreat. But I didn't move, and neither did she. For a second, or maybe a minute, time had lost its shape. We just existed in that contact. The touch was a live wire. It carried a current that had nothing to do with survival. It was an interrogation. "Are you awake? Do you feel this? Is this just body heat, or is it gravity?" My mind scrambled for the rational explanation. This is proximity. This is adrenaline dump. This is the biological imperative to seek warmth. I am a professional woman with a carefully curated existence. I do not lie in the dark on top of a mountain and feel the earth shift because a stranger's arm is warm. Rachel shifted then, just slightly. She didn't pull away. She leaned back, pressing harder against my spine, a silent answer to a question I hadn't dared to ask. The pressure was grounding. It anchored me. The shivering stopped, replaced by a heavy, languid heat that settled deep in my chest. The wind kept howling, tearing at the guy lines, but inside, the war was over. Exhaustion, heavy and gray, finally pulled me under, dragging me down into a sleep that smelled of rain and felt like her. Morning didn't break. It infiltrated. A gray, diluted light seeped through the rainfly, turning the orange nylon walls a sickly, pale peach. Consciousness returned to me in slow, jagged waves, dragging me up from a depth of sleep I hadn't touched in years. I was aware first of the heat, a heavy, anchoring warmth that seemed to be everywhere, and then of the restriction. My body, usually so contained, so disciplined in its boundaries, had gone rogue. I wasn't back to back with her anymore. Sometime in the hollow hours of the night, the geometry of survival had collapsed entirely. We were entangled. My left leg was hooked over her shin, pinning her down. My arm was draped heavily across her waist, my hand resting flat against the rise and fall of her stomach, and she was facing me. Her forehead rested against my collarbone, her breath warm and damp against my throat. We were a knot, a complicated, desperate tangle of limbs tied by the cold and the dark. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The memory of where I was, and who I was with, slammed back into place. I jerked back, scrambling against the slick nylon floor until my shoulders hit the tent wall. The sudden movement broke the seal of warmth we'd created. Cold air rushed into the gap between us, aggressive and instant, filling the space where her body had been. It felt like being stripped. Condensation from the tent ceiling shook loose, raining down on us in freezing, tiny drops. Rachel stirred. She didn't scramble. She didn't gasp. She simply opened her eyes, blinking once against the gray light. For a second, looking at me from the tangle of sleeping bags, she looked unguarded, soft. Then, the recognition set in. The mask slid back into place. The calm, efficient hiker, the stranger. She sat up, pulling her fleece tight around her neck, turning her back to me to find her boots. The silence in the tent was heavier than the storm had been. It was thick with the things we weren't saying, charged with the memory of where my hand had been moments ago. I needed noise. I needed a task. I grabbed the stove, my fingers clumsy with the cold, and focused entirely on the mechanics of ignition. The hiss of the fuel line was a mercy. The blue flame roared to life, a jet engine sound that filled the small space and made speech unnecessary. I watched the water boil with an intensity that bordered on obsessive, refusing to look at the woman sitting 2 feet away. We drank the coffee black, passing the single metal cup back, and forth like a ritual offering, the steam rose between us, a temporary screen. When our fingers brushed during the transfer, I pulled back too quickly, spilling a few hot drops on my knee. I didn't flinch. I just stared at the dark stain spreading on the fabric. "Storm broke," Rachel said finally. Her voice was rough with sleep, low and vibrating in the small space. She gestured to the vestibule where a slice of clear, brutal blue sky was visible. "The pressure is rising." "Good," I said. My voice sounded brittle, overly formal. "I can make the descend." "With one pull?" She looked at me then, over the rim of the cup. Her gaze was unflinching, stripping away my attempt at competence. "The trail turns to scree above the tree line. If the wind picks up again, a bivy sack won't hold. We hike together." It wasn't an offer. It was an assessment. And she was right. My precision planning had failed. I was now a liability. "Fine," I said, looking away. "For safety." "Right, safety." Packing up the tent felt like dismantling a crime scene. We moved around each other in the small clearing, folding the wet nylon, collapsing the poles. This object, this flimsy structure of fabric and aluminum, had been a world for 12 hours. It had forced a proximity that shattered my carefully maintained distance. Now we were folding it into a tight, unrecognizable square, shoving it into the bottom of a pack. We were hiding the evidence. When we finally shouldered our packs, the weight felt different. The air was cold, crisp, and indifferent, but the dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably. We weren't strangers anymore. We were conspirators. I looked at the trail stretching upward, then at Rachel's back as she started the ascent. I followed, stepping into her rhythm, unable to shake the ghost sensation of her breath against my throat. The geography changed from the lush, deceptive softness of the lower forest to something harder, cleaner, and infinitely more punishing. We were climbing out of the valley, aiming for the ridge that would eventually lead us back to civilization, but the mountains seemed determined to make us earn every inch of elevation. The trail disintegrated into a field of loose scree, a chaotic spill of gray stone that shifted underfoot like ball bearings. Every step was a negotiation with gravity, a calculation of friction and leverage. I spent the next 3 hours falling into her slipstream. It was irritating. I am used to leading, to setting the pace, to being the one who breaks the wind and chooses the line. But the terrain demanded a humility I wasn't used to giving, so I let her take the front. We stopped speaking. The air grew too thin for a casual chatter, and the terrain required a focus that precluded small talk. But a different kind of communication emerged, a silent language of nods and gestures born of necessity. When she paused to drink, I paused. When I stumbled on a shifting slate, she slowed without turning around, waiting until she heard my rhythm return. We weren't friends. We weren't even really acquaintances. We were a unit, fused by the singular goal of not falling off the side of the mountain. The crux came at a limestone chimney, a narrow vertical chute, where the trail simply gave up. It was a scramble requiring hands and boots wedged into cracks. Rachel went first, moving with that infuriating grace, finding holds I couldn't see. She pulled herself up onto a ledge, then turned back, looking down at me. "Give me your hand," she commanded. I hesitated. I had my footing. I could make the move. But the rock was slick with melting ice, and the drop below was significant. I reached up. Her grip locked around my wrist. It wasn't a polite assistance. It was a clamp. Her hand was rough, calloused from days on the rock, but warm. The sensation of her skin against mine cut through the exhaustion, a sharp, electric reminder of the night before. She didn't just stabilize me, she hauled me up, her strength surprising in its intensity. For a moment, as I scrambled onto the ledge, we were chest to chest again, the space between us collapsing. I could smell the sweat on her neck, the pine resin on her jacket. She didn't let go immediately. She held my gaze, her eyes dark and unreadable, checking for panic, checking for injury, or perhaps checking for something else entirely. "You're good," she said, releasing me. The air around my wrist felt suddenly cold. "I'm good," I lied. My pulse was hammering in my throat, and it wasn't from the climb. We sat on the ledge to recover, legs dangling over the void. The adrenaline began to recede, leaving a raw, open space for conversation. She passed me a water bottle, her fingers brushing mine, lighter this time. "You move well for someone who lives in a tower," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the invisible horizon where the cities lay. "I don't live in a tower," I corrected, taking a drink. "I live in a calendar. My life is a series of 15-minute blocks, negotiated settlements, and crisis management. I come here to remember what it feels like to have a problem that can't be solved with an email." I didn't mean to say it. I keep my other life guarded, a separate country from the trail. But the thin air makes you loose. Or maybe it was just her. Rachel looked at me, really looked at me, and I saw the recognition click into place. She knew that look. She knew the specific exhaustion of being the person everyone else relies on. "Noise," she said simply. "You come here to turn down the volume." "I come here to hear myself think," I admitted. "Or maybe to stop thinking." She nodded, turning her gaze back to the peaks. "The mountain doesn't care if you're successful. It just cares if you can walk. There's an honesty in that." We sat in silence for a long time, the shared understanding settling between us like a heavy, comfortable blanket. But the sun was dropping fast. The light had turned from the harsh white of midday to a deep, bruising gold, casting long shadows that stretched across the valley floor. The temperature began to plummet, the familiar bite of the evening chill returning. We checked the map. The trailhead was still miles away, across a ridge that would be treacherous in the dark. I looked at Rachel. She looked at the sky. We didn't need to say it. We weren't going back to our cars tonight. The mountain had one more night for us. The plateau was a flat granite palm held up against the darkening sky. The wind had died completely, leaving a silence that was expansive. It filled the valley below with a deep, velvet quiet. We dropped our packs near a ring of stones, left by previous hikers. The emergency was over. The sky was clear, the temperature manageable. There was absolutely no meteorological reason to share a tent tonight. I knew this. The logic was irrefutable. I stood there, staring at my pack, knowing I should pull out my bivy sack. It would be cold, uncomfortable, and solitary. Exactly the isolation I had claimed to want. I reached for the strap, my fingers lingering on the buckle. I was performing hesitation, waiting for a script change I couldn't initiate. To ask would be to admit I wanted the proximity. Rachel didn't wait for my hesitation to finish. She dropped her pack and kicked a flat spot clear of pine cones. "Don't bother with the bivy," she said. She didn't look at me. She was busy unbuckling her tent. "It's pointless to set up 2 camps when we're leaving at dawn. Less to pack up in the morning." "Efficiency," I said. The word felt heavy on my tongue. "Efficiency," she echoed. She looked up then, her eyes catching the last of the light. There was a challenge there, or maybe an invitation. Unless you prefer the dirt. The tent is fine, I said, my voice too casual. My heart gave a single, hard thud against my ribs. We both knew the logistics were thin, a paper shield over what was actually happening. Setting up the tent in the calm evening air felt radically different from the frantic, storm-lashed construction of the previous night. It was slow and deliberate. We moved around each other in the twilight, snapping poles into place and clipping the fly. It felt domestic. There's a specific intimacy to building a home with someone, even if it only exists for 12 hours. When I handed her a steak, our fingers brushed. We didn't pull away this time. We let the contact linger for a second, a silent acknowledgement of the current running between us. Dinner was a shared affair. We sat on a flat rock, shoulders almost touching, passing a pot of dehydrated risotto back and forth. In the city, a dinner date is a production of reservations and orchestration. Here it was a single spoon and a pot of salty, rehydrated rice. I watched the unself-conscious way she scraped the bottom of the pot, the focus she gave to the simple act of refueling. "You're quieter tonight," she observed, handing the pot back to me. "I'm thinking," I said, "about the descent." "About the difference," I admitted. I looked out over the valley, where the first stars were beginning to prick through the purple haze. Back there, down in the noise, I have to be a fortress. I have to be impenetrable. Up here, I feel permeable, she suggested. I looked at her. The firelight caught the sharp angle of her jaw, the softness of her mouth. Yes, permeable. She set her cup down. "The walls we build are heavy," she said quietly. "It's exhausting carrying them up a mountain. I think you left yours at the trailhead." "I think I did." The conversation drifted into the silence, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the crackle of the small fire we'd built, the vastness of the galaxy wheeling overhead, and the undeniable pull of the woman sitting next to me. The air between us was no longer just cold. It was charged, heavy with potential. We weren't just two hikers surviving a storm anymore. We were two women sitting in the dark, waiting for the other to make the move that would shatter the last of the distance. The fire burned down to embers, glowing like red eyes in the dark. The cold began to settle in earnest, creeping up from the ground. "It's time," Rachel said, standing up and brushing the dirt from her pants. She looked at the tent, glowing faintly in the starlight. "Ready?" "Ready," I lied. I wasn't ready. I was terrified, not of the coal and not of the mountain. I was terrified of what would happen when that zipper closed us in again, with no storm to blame for what I wanted to do. Crawling into the tent felt different this time. Last night it was a bunker against the apocalypse. Tonight it felt like stepping into a confession booth. The smell of pine resin and damp earth was stronger now, trapped inside with us. I listened to the zipper close, that final sealing sound, and felt the air pressure shift. It wasn't the storm outside anymore. It was the pressure of us. We moved with a quiet, synchronized familiarity. Boots off, outer layers shed. We knew the choreography now, but the script had changed. Last night, the mandate was survival. Tonight, the mandate was unspoken and terrifyingly ambiguous. We stripped down without the frantic haste of the storm, every movement deliberate, every pause heavy. I slid into my sleeping bag, the cold silk of the liner shocking against my skin. I waited for her to turn her back. That was the protocol. That was the safety mechanism we had established to keep this professional. But she didn't turn. Rachel settled in, the rustle of her movement stopping abruptly. She was facing me. In the absolute dark of the wilderness, you don't see faces. You sense presence. I could feel the heat radiating from her chest, a steady, rhythmic warmth that reached across the narrow gap between our mats. I could hear the pattern of her breathing, slightly shallow, slightly fast. She was awake. She was right there. The 6 inches of dead air between our noses felt like a canyon we were both leaning over. "You're still tense," she whispered. Her voice didn't have to travel far. It was right against my ear, intimate and low. It bypassed my auditory processing and went straight to my nervous system. Old habits, I whispered back. My voice sounded stripped, lacking the professional polish I wear like armor. I'm used to sleeping with one eye open. Not out here, she murmured. Out here, you just sleep. Or you don't. I don't think I'm sleeping tonight. No, she agreed. The word hung there, heavy with implication. We lay in the silence for a long time, the tension coiling tighter with every exhale. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was magnetic. It was the feeling of gravity shifting, of the room tilting until everything slid toward the center, toward her. I saw you, she said suddenly. The admission came out of the dark like a stone dropped in a well. You said that, on the switchback. No, she corrected. Before that, at the trailhead, 3 days ago. My heart stalled. I lay perfectly still, waiting. You were arguing with someone on the phone, she continued, her voice steady, reciting the memory like a fact. You were pacing by your car. You looked furious and beautiful, like a storm waiting to break. I watched you hang up, turn off the phone, and throw it into the back seat like it was a grenade. I felt a flush rise up my neck, hot and sudden. I thought I had been invisible in my frustration. I thought I had been alone. I didn't think anyone was watching, I managed. I'm always watching, she said. There was no apology in her tone. I saw you check your map 4 times before you even locked the car. I saw the way you double-knotted your boots. You move through the world like you're trying to solve it before it can hurt you. The accuracy of it, the precision of her observation, left me breathless. It reversed the polarity. I am the observer. I am the one who assesses, calculates, and predicts. To be the subject of someone else's study, to be seen so clearly by a stranger in the dark, felt dangerously exposing. It felt like she had reached into the dark and put her hand directly on my chest. Why are you telling me this? I asked. The question was a whisper, fragile. Because I don't want you to think this is just about the tent, she said, or the storm, or the cold. The air in the tent thickened. It became viscous, heavy with the truth she had just laid out between us. The pretense evaporated entirely, leaving us with the raw, unvarnished reality. We weren't here because of a broken tent pole. We were here because of a magnetic pull that had started in a parking lot 3 days ago. I could feel her gaze on me in the dark, unflinching and expectant. She wasn't waiting for me to solve the equation. She was waiting for me to accept the result. The distance between us wasn't safety anymore. It was just distance, and it was disappearing fast. My hand moved before I gave it permission to. It was a rebellion against the discipline I had spent a lifetime perfecting, a betrayal of the careful, risk-averse architecture I built my life around. In the boardroom, I never make a move without knowing the outcome. I never leverage a position unless I have the capital to back it up. But here, in the suffocating electric dark of a nylon tent, I was bankrupt of strategy. I reached out across the narrow chasm of dead air between our sleeping bags. The movement felt agonizingly slow, like moving through water. The cold air of the tent bit at my fingertips, a sharp contrast to the radiating warmth I was reaching for. I wasn't reaching for the survivalist, the efficient stranger who could splint a broken pole or navigate a scree field. I was reaching for the woman who had watched me unravel in a parking lot and understood exactly why. My fingers brushed the line of her jaw. It was a tentative contact, a question asked in the only language that mattered now. Her skin was hot, shockingly soft against the calloused roughness of my own hand. I traced the line of bone from her ear to her chin, feeling the pulse hammering beneath the surface. It was fast, a frantic staccato rhythm that betrayed the calm stillness of her body. She didn't pull away. That was the pivotal moment, the turn where the story could have collapsed back into safety, but didn't. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't freeze. Instead, she leaned into the touch. She pressed her face against my palm, a gesture of surrender that felt louder than a scream. In the shadows, I couldn't see the details of her eyes, but I could feel the weight of her gaze. It was that same unflinching look she had given me on the trail, the one that stripped away the pretense and saw the raw, shivering thing underneath. Rachel, I breathed. The name felt heavy, significant. She didn't answer with words. She shifted, the rustle of the sleeping bag a harsh sound in the quiet, and closed the remaining distance. Her hand came up, finding the back of my neck, her fingers tangling in my hair. The grip was firm, grounding, possessing the same terrifying competence she applied to everything else. When she kissed me, it wasn't tentative. There was no testing of the waters, no polite negotiation of boundaries. It was a collision. It was the release of 3 days of pressure, the snapping of a tension line that had been pulled too tight. Her mouth was warm, tasting of tea and the wild, metallic sharpness of the high air. The kiss wasn't desperate, but it was inevitable. It felt like the sudden, violent breaking of a storm, the moment the rain finally starts to fall and the pressure in the atmosphere equalizes. I made a sound, a low, broken noise that I would have been mortified by in my other life. But that life was miles away, down in the valley, locked in a car with my phone and my schedule. Up here, there was only this, the sensation of her body pressing against mine, the clumsy interference of the sleeping bags, the friction of wool and fleece, and the overwhelming, dizzying heat of her mouth. We shed our identities like wet gear. I wasn't the consultant, the fixer, the woman who lived in a tower of schedules. She wasn't the hiker, the stranger, the observer. We were just two bodies in the dark, seeking something more vital than warmth. The hiker persona, the one concerned with mileage and weather patterns, dissolved, leaving behind something rawer. Her hands were rough, the skin catch points of calluses earned on the rock, but her touch was agonizingly precise. She traced the line of my spine through the thermal layer, mapping me with the same focus she used on the terrain. Every place she touched seemed to catch fire, a network of nerves lighting up on a grid that had been dark for too long. The wind outside might have picked up, or it might have died completely. I honestly couldn't tell you. The world had shrunk to the radius of her reach. I realized then, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I had miscalculated the objective. I thought the summit was the peak of the mountain. I was wrong. The summit wasn't a place on a map. It was this. The climb had just been the commute. This connection, this heat, was the destination. We lay tangled in the dark, breathing each other's air, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't planning my next move. I was just there. The morning after didn't have the sharp, frantic edges of the first. We woke up in a tangle again, but this time, nobody pulled away. The light filtering through the orange nylon was warm, lacking the gray hostility of the storm. We lay there for a long time, the silence between us heavy and comfortable, listening to the wind move through the pines outside. It wasn't the silence of strangers trying to be polite. It was the silence of two people who had said everything that mattered without using words. Packing up was a slow, deliberate ritual. We folded the tent, the object that had been our entire world, with a quiet reverence. It felt less like packing gear and more like dismantling a shrine. When I handed her the stuff sack, our fingers lingered, a silent acknowledgement of what we were putting away. The descent is physically easier, but mentally, it's a burden. Gravity pulls you down, but your mind tries to anchor itself to the peak. My chest felt tight. We moved down the trail in a synchronized rhythm, a single unit moving over the rock, but with every switchback, the air grew thicker, warmer, and heavier. The valley floor was rising to meet us, bringing with it the inevitable return of the world we had escaped. I watched Rachel's back as she navigated a root system. I memorized the way she moved, the set of her shoulders. A cold fear began to pool in my stomach, distinct from the physical chill of the mountain. Hikers talk about trail magic, the idea that the wilderness creates its own reality, suspended and separate from the rest of life. I was terrified that this was just that, a hallucination born of altitude, adrenaline, and isolation. It's easy to feel a connection when you're the only two people on Earth. It's much harder to sustain it when the signal bars return and the emails start flooding in. I wondered if we were just two desperate variables in a survival equation that had been solved. Once the danger is gone, does the chemistry evaporate with the adrenaline? The transition was abrupt. 1 minute, we were in the cool, pine-scented silence of the forest. The next, we popped out onto the gravel access road. The noise hit me first. The slam of a car door, the shriek of a child, the low rumble of an idling engine. Then the smell, exhaust fumes, and sunscreen. It felt violent. It felt like waking up from a lucid dream to a fire alarm. The sun glinting off a chrome bumper blinded me for a second. A harsh reminder that we were back in the land of manufactured things. We walked to our cars, parked 3 spaces apart. The distance felt like a canyon. I unlocked my SUV, the chirping alarm sounding jarringly modern and ridiculous. I threw my pack into the trunk, the same pack that held the debris of the life I had brought up here 3 days ago. It felt heavier now. Rachel leaned against the hood of her dusty sedan, arms crossed, watching me. She didn't look like the fierce, elemental creature from the tent anymore. She looked like a woman in a parking lot. But then she caught my eye, and that unflinching, piercing gaze was the same. It cut through the noise of the tourists and the visual clutter of the trailhead. I walked over to her. The gravel crunched under my boots, loud and abrasive. "So," I said, feeling suddenly awkward, stripped of the intimacy of the dark. "So," she replied. She didn't smile, but the corner of her mouth quirked up. "Back to the tower. Back to the calendar," I corrected, leaning against the metal of her car. It was warm from the sun. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. It looked alien in her hand, a black slab of obligation. "I'm not letting you disappear into a meeting," she said, her voice low enough to slide under the noise of a nearby family arguing about a cooler. "Give me your number." I recited the digits. It felt like handing over the keys to the fortress. She typed it in, her thumb moving with the same terrifying efficiency she used to secure a guy line. "I'll text you," she said, locking the screen, "when the noise gets too loud." "Please do." She opened her car door, then paused. She looked at me over the roof of the car, the sun catching the stray hairs escaping her braid. "Hey," she said. "Yeah?" "It wasn't just the body heat." The words landed with the weight of a physical touch. I felt a smile break across my face, unbidden and real. "I know, it never was." "Good." She got in. The engine started. I stood there, watching her back out, watching the red taillights recede down the dusty road until they were swallowed by the trees. I got into my own car, the silence of the cabin deafening. I looked in the rearview mirror. My face looked different, less guarded, permeable. I merged onto the highway, the mountain shrinking to a jagged, purple line in the rearview mirror. The asphalt hummed under the tires, a monotonous, gray drone of civilization. Then, a vibration on the passenger seat. My phone lit up. A single message from a number I didn't have saved, but knew by heart. "Loud down here. Missing the quiet already." I smiled. The wilderness hadn't been an escape. It was an introduction. If you've ever found something real in the middle of nowhere, subscribe for more stories.